Hello and welcome to my oral presentation. In this oral report, I will be discussing on the trade war, tariffs, and the implications that President Donald Trump has had on the world as we know it. The agenda for my report would unfold as follows. First, I would provide a description of the crisis in question, which is the trade war. Next, I will explain the different actors who are involved. More specifically, the main characters versus those who seem to be caught up in the crosshairs. Following that, we talk on who is to assume responsibility for the crisis. Finally, I would conclude by predicting what the future of international trade is going to look like and the effects of the trade war. I will also summarize some tactics used by countries to dodge tariffs. The references for the content used in this video will be available towards the end. In 2018, President Donald Trump kicked off a major shift in global trade policy by launching a trade war mainly aimed at China. He accused China of unfair trade practices like stealing intellectual property, forcing US companies to hand over their tech, and giving huge support to Chinese industries. Ironically, the United States has also followed some of these policies in its formative years, and these policies are what would pipe the US and some other Western countries to become developed countries in the first place. For example, China giving subsidies to industries has also been followed by the US. Moving on, at first, tariffs focused on China, starting with $34 billion worth of goods such as electronics and machinery. By 2020, that number had grown to over $360 billion worth of goods. China did hit back with tariffs of its own, mostly on US agricultural products, which hurt American farmers. But Trump didn't stop with China. In his second term, he turned to allies like Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, claiming that deals such as the CUSMA and the World Trade Organization's rules were bad for the US. He also used a national security argument to slap tariffs on steel and aluminium of 25 and 10% respectively. Canada, being the US's supplier of both, was hit hard and own tariffs on responded with its own tariffs on American-made goods such as dairy and auto parts. This has resulted in a lot of tension, rising costs, and uncertainty for business and consumers in both countries. President Trump's reasoning for imposing tariffs was to bring back a kind of industrial golden age in the US, similar to what existed under President William McKinley in the early 1900s. McKinley used high tariffs to build up American industries, and Trump wanted to repeat that model. But here's the problem. The world and the US has changed drastically since then. Back in McKinley's time, most Americans worked in farming or low-wage factory jobs. Labor was cheap, and very few people went to college. Further, the US made the world's cheapest steel and aluminium back then. On top of that, the government relied heavily on tariffs for revenue because there was no federal income tax code. Fast forward to today, only 9% of Americans work in manufacturing. and most aspire to go to college, aiming to get white collar careers. Labor costs are also much higher in the US compared to countries like China or India. In India, it's $2 per hour, and in China, it's around $5 compared to compared to the USA, where labor cost is almost $18 per hour. Thus, manufacturing in other countries is cheaper, and that's the reason why manufacturing moved out of US in the first place. Plus, US made steel now costs significantly higher than steel from Japan or China. And let's not forget, the USA no longer needs tariffs for its government revenue. It already collects over half its revenue through federal taxes. So while the idea of reviving American industry through tariffs sounds patriotic, economically it doesn't add up. If the president's tall speeches follow through, it will cost us dearly. For example, Jim Farley, the CEO of Ford, points out that the real impact of these tariffs on everyday Americans. He estimates that tariffs alone would push the average car price by almost $1,800. But if all the steel and aluminum had to be sourced from within the US, that cost would skyrocket to over $8,000 per car. That is more than what an average family would spend on groceries in a year. Actors and interests. At this point, the entire world has been dragged in. But let's look at the bigger players in this quagmire. The US government under President Trump was the main driving force behind the trade war. Trump believed that the US was losing out in global trade, especially with China and more recently with Canada. His administration wanted to fix the trade deficit, bring back manufacturing jobs, and cut down China's growing influence. But while the tariffs were meant to pressure other countries, they also ended up hurting American interest, American farmers and manufacturers who depend on Chinese markets and supply chains. China, as the original target of the tariffs, responded quickly. The government led by Xi Jinping hit back with tariffs on major US exports such as soybeans, pork, and cars. Their strategy was to first hit where it hurts in US farm states and reduce reliance on the United States by boosting trade with countries such as Brazil and Russia, and also expand trade to other BRICS nations. Canada, a long-time trade partner, was blindsided by the sudden tariffs in 2025. Even though it was part of the CUSMA and had good trade relations with the US, it got slapped with steel and aluminum tariffs under the guise of national security. Prime Minister Trudeau fought back with counter tariffs, trying to defend Canadian industries, while still keeping ties with the US strong. But the whole situation has left Canada in a tough spot with a lot of uncertainty looming ahead. Why the Buy Canadian movement is not really practical. The Buy Canadian movement sounded like a great idea to support local businesses and strengthen our economy. But in practice, it's starting to backfire on regular Canadians. Some companies are using it as an excuse to hike up prices, take advantage of people's patriotism. The idea was to build a local supply chains, but instead it's become a way for people to cash in. So now we are really just paying extra to prove that we are patriotic. And here's the twist: American companies are getting in on it too. They're branding their products as Canadian and selling them at higher prices. Take Diana sauce, for example, the picture given in the illustration. It's made by Kraft Heinz Canada, which is actually owned by the US-based Kraft Heinz company. The sauce used to cost $3, but now it's $3.79 thanks to the so-called patriotism tax. In the end, Canadians are paying more with little benefit to show for it. While the Trump administration's policies were the immediate trigger of the trade war, the roots go deeper than just politics. Let's discuss who is to assume responsibility for this crisis. One big factor was the shift in the global economy. China was no longer just a manufacturer, it was evolving into a producer of high value goods and becoming more of a consumption driven economy. To the US, this looked like a rising threat to its own global influence and competitiveness. That shift in power created tension, and instead of working on it through global systems or global platforms, the US and its allies took a more aggressive route by imposing unilateral tariffs. It was a controversial move that many felt would only make things worse. In my point of view, President Trump's tariffs are less about protecting American industries and more about recovering the massive revenue loss from the $4 trillion worth of tax cuts that were passed in February of 2025. These cuts weren't just economic policy, they seemed more to be a payoff to those who helped finance the elections all the way to the Oval Office. The math is pretty revealing. The tax cost The tax cuts cost the US Treasury around $1.1 billion each year. And meanwhile, the US imports about 3.75 trillion worth of goods, and a 20% tariff could rake in about $750 billion in revenue. So it looks like the tariffs are just a way to balance the books, shift the burden to customers and businesses, while using slogans like Make America Great Again or blaming Canada and the EU to distract the public. It's all smoke and mirrors to keep MAGA supporters focused on nationalism while the real agenda plays out behind the scenes. Predictions and recommendations. Bringing manufacturing back to the US sounds great in theory, but in reality, it costs a lot. If production shifts to America, wages have to rise just to maintain people's standard of living. But how do you pay for that? You either print more money, risking inflation, you force other countries to invest in US debt, which again is unlikely, or devalue the dollar, and that solution isn't sustainable. So the best is the US can bring back some higher end manufacturing for a few processes, but that too at a higher cost. The bigger issue is political. President Trump is in his final term, meaning that he no longer needs to win votes. That's why he can push extreme policies without restraint. He's surrounded by people who won't challenge him, and it shows. Honestly, it feels like Washington no longer cares about regular people. That's why countries like Canada need to be cautious. Imposing counter tariffs or cutting exports may sound like strong moves, but they can end up hurting our own people. Take a family like Jake, Christina, and their son Paul. Jake works at Ontario Hydro, Christina at Technion, a furniture company that mostly exports to the US, and Paul is an oil sands engineer in Alberta. Trump's tariffs slow US demand, so Christina's hours are cut at the factory. Oil exports dip, so Paul and Jake take pay cuts too. Their income drops by 25%, and just as they try to budget and save, they are hit with rising prices, because Canadian tariffs make US imports like groceries, electronics, and essentials more expensive. In the end, it's families like theirs that feel the pain while the political elites in DC and Ottawa play games. Now let's talk about real solutions to deal with these tariffs, ones that actually make sense for Canada. A lot of electronics and appliances we get from US are originally made in China. American wholesalers import in bulk and sell to us with a markup. Canada used to benefit from those bulk deals, but now as the US has turned hostile, it's time we cut them out of the middle. Canada should start importing directly from China. It's more efficient and it helps to avoid retaliatory tariffs on the US. Take Chinese vehicles or Chinese EVs. Canada imposed a 100% tariff on them. Ironically, this was a move to protect Elon Musk. This move made EVs more expensive for Canadians. Instead, why not do the opposite? Scrap these measures and even tax Tesla instead. That way, Canadians can afford quality EVs from China and we can actually make progress toward our 2030 goal of zero emission. There are also some clever business tricks. One is forward invoicing. Let's say you used to import $100 million worth of goods from the US. Instead, you now only place an order for 50 million and you prepay another 50 million as an advance for a future shipment. If that shipment in the future is cancelled, you technically imported only 50 million worth of goods and you cut your tariff bill in half. It's not a perfect solution, but it works. Finally, there's trade rerouting. China is already doing this by sending goods through Vietnam or Bangladesh, so the final product isn't labeled as made in China. But now that the president wants tariffs on everyone, what will this even look like? I would like to leave you with some food for thought by commenting on what happened more recently with China after my written report on the 31st of March. Donald Trump still lives in the 1980s. After all, he is 78 years old and just as old as Biden was when he became president. He still looks at China as a nation of traders and merchants and people who yearn to go to the US and who would lap up the 3D films that the US had to show, like Transformers, for example. He looks at Europe as a group of nations devastated by World War II and pumped back to life by the United States' US dollar under the Marshall Plan. He looks at Russia as the former USSR, a heavyweight who gave the US sleepless nights for 40 years. That's why he has so much respect for Putin and almost adores the man. China is no longer that nation it was back in 2000s or 2005 or even 2010. It is a nation of it is a nation that is a great power and rebuilding on what a 5,000-year-old civilization is. It's developing national pride only Americans living during Pearl Harbor of 1941 or the Kennedy assassination of 1963 could fathom. They have done their math and believe that they can take temporary pain but inflict more damage on the US and weaken them, which would help them in inevitable when the inevitable war comes to the South China Sea. As for the cabinet in DC, they are lipstical yes men who are there to enrich themselves and make deals for themselves. The counter tariffs of 125% is not a show of confidence by China, but is in fact resignation and an acceptance of the inevitable. Since the Obama administration They have been trying to ensure that China weakens and loses unity and loses ability and their edge to compete. Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump again are trying to do the same thing. So when the Chinese have so the Chinese have always known that a major offensive was on its way from the US, whether it was a limited series of body blows by the Obama administration, a series of technology related sanctions and restrictions by the Biden administration, or this current tariff escalation by Trump. So in a way, the Chinese are revealed. Uh, so in a way, the Chinese are now relieved that everything is out in the open and know they can save face with their own people. The Chinese people will suffer pain for sure. A lot of Chinese will have to go back to their villages, especially workers who work in factories designated for US exports. But there won't be supply shocks like those faced by Sri Lanka and Russia in 2022 because Chinese have all the raw materials, food, and energy they want. But in the USA, there are small businesses, mom and pop stores, in small towns which average about $175,000 a year in post taxes. This ensured that they paid their bills, they paid their mortgage checks, and had some money saved over and could afford insurance. These mom and pop stores, small businesses, can't exactly afford to restructure their supply chains. I also expect Trump to refuse to honor Chinese treasuries and freeze Chinese assets if the wind continues to blow in the same direction. At the end of the day, good policy should help families, not break them. And that's what we need to remember in this trade war. Thank you.